The sun rose over the quiet streets of an upscale neighborhood, casting a golden glow on the pristine lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. In one of the houses, 11-year-old Marcus Johnson stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. Today was his first day at St. Augustine's Academy, a private school known for its high standards and long list of successful alumni. For weeks, Marcus had been both excited and nervous about starting this new chapter. He dreamed of making friends, excelling in his studies, and proving himself in a place where everyone seemed so accomplished. Marcus's family wasn't wealthy like many of the other families at St. Augustine's. They were middle class, but they valued education above all else. His father, Dr. Jonathan Johnson, often reminded him that knowledge was the key to opening doors no one could close. What Marcus didn't know yet was that his dad had recently accepted a secret role as the school's new principal, though he hadn't told anyone, not even Marcus. The decision was made quietly, partly because Dr. Johnson wanted Marcus to experience life at the school without special treatment or bias. As Marcus stepped out of the car, clutching his backpack tightly, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The sprawling campus looked more like a college than a grade school, with its towering brick buildings and manicured gardens. Students milled about in crisp uniforms, chatting animatedly while parents exchanged polite greetings nearby. Marcus scanned the crowd, searching for someone who might look friendly, but most kids seemed absorbed in their own conversations. Inside the classroom, things got off to a rocky start almost immediately. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, a stern-looking woman with sharp features and an even sharper tone, greeted the students with a brief introduction before diving straight into her lesson plan. She had a reputation for being strict but effective, and many parents admired her dedication. But there was something cold about the way she spoke, something that made Marcus uneasy right away. During roll call, when Mrs. Harper reached Marcus's name, she paused slightly, her eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. "Johnson," she repeated slowly, glancing up from her attendance sheet. "Are you related to?" Her voice trailed off, leaving the question hanging awkwardly in the air. Before Marcus could respond, she moved on to the next student, dismissing him with a flick of her pen. Throughout the morning, Marcus tried his best to stay focused, raising his hand whenever possible and answering questions confidently. But every time he spoke, Mrs. Harper seemed to find fault. When he offered an insightful comment during a discussion about history, she criticized him for speaking out of turn. When he asked a thoughtful question about the reading assignment, she snapped, "We don't have time for tangents." Each remark chipped away at Marcus's confidence, though he tried hard not to let it show. By lunchtime, Marcus felt exhausted. Sitting alone at a table in the cafeteria, he picked at his sandwich while watching groups of students laugh and joke around. No one approached him, and he wondered if they'd already decided he didn't belong. Still, Marcus refused to give up. He reminded himself why he was here: to learn, to grow, and to make his parents proud. Little did he know, the challenges ahead would test him in ways he couldn't imagine. The days turned into weeks, and Marcus found himself growing more accustomed to the rhythm of life at St. Augustine's Academy, or so he thought. Each morning began with a mix of hope and dread as he stepped into Mrs. Harper's classroom. At first, he had tried to brush off her sharp remarks, convincing himself that maybe he was just being too sensitive. But it soon became clear that her behavior toward him was different from how she treated the other students. It all started during a math lesson when Marcus interrupted her mid-sentence to ask a clarifying question about fractions. He didn't mean to interrupt. He simply wanted to understand the concept better before they moved on. Instead of answering politely, Mrs. Harper stopped writing on the board and turned to face him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with irritation, "if you paid attention instead of daydreaming, you wouldn't need to ask such basic questions." The comment stung, but what hurt even more was the snickering from some of his classmates. Marcus sank lower in his seat, cheeks burning with embarrassment. From that moment on, Mrs. Harper seemed to single him out constantly. If another student whispered an answer incorrectly, she'd gently correct them and move on. But if Marcus made the slightest mistake, she'd seize the opportunity to lecture him in front of everyone. During a science experiment, when Marcus accidentally spilled a small amount of water while setting up his equipment, Mrs. Harper loudly declared, "Carelessness is unacceptable here. Perhaps you should stick to simpler tasks." The entire class fell silent, and Marcus felt like shrinking into invisibility. Things escalated further when the class was assigned a major project on historical figures. Marcus chose to research Frederick Douglass, inspired by the abolitionists' courage and determination. He spent hours crafting his presentation, determined to impress not only Mrs. Harper but also his peers. On the day of the presentations, Marcus stood nervously at the front of the room, gripping his notes tightly. As he spoke, he noticed Mrs. Harper glaring at him over her glasses, tapping her pen against her desk impatiently. When he finished, instead of acknowledging his effort, she remarked, "While your enthusiasm is commendable, Marcus, the depth of analysis was lacking. Maybe next time, choose someone less predictable." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Predictable. Was she mocking him because he was black and chose to highlight a black historical figure? Marcus couldn't be sure, but the implication was hard to ignore. His classmates exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed amused by his discomfort. Either way, Marcus felt completely alone. Outside of class, things weren't much better. Word spread quickly among the students about Mrs. Harper's treatment of Marcus, and though some kids pitied him, others used it as fuel for their own cruelty. In the hallway, a group of boys mimicked her tone, pretending to scold each other with exaggerated sighs and eye rolls. "Oh no, don't spill your water again," one of them joked, earning chuckles from the rest. Marcus kept his head down, pretending not to hear, but inside, he felt crushed. At home, Marcus tried to hide his growing frustration. Dinner conversations were filled with talk about school, but whenever his parents asked how things were going, he shrugged and said everything was fine. He didn't want to worry them, especially since they'd sacrificed so much to send him to Street Augustine's. Still, late at night, lying awake in bed, Marcus replayed Mrs. Harper's cutting remarks in his mind. Why did she treat him differently? Was it because of his race, or was there something else he was missing? Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus refused to let Mrs. Harper break him. Every morning, he woke up determined to prove her wrong, to show her that he belonged at Street Augustine's just as much as anyone else. But deep down, he wondered how long he could keep fighting a battle that felt increasingly unfair. Little did he know, the worst was yet to come, and the truth about his connection to the school would soon change everything, for both him and Mrs. Harper. As the weeks dragged on, Mrs. Harper's behavior toward Marcus became more relentless, almost like a storm that refused to pass. What started as subtle digs and sarcastic remarks turned into outright targeting, leaving Marcus feeling cornered and powerless. It wasn't just about the way she spoke to him anymore. It was how she treated his work, his presence, and even his appearance. One afternoon, during a writing assignment, Marcus poured his heart into crafting an essay about his dreams for the future. He wrote about wanting to become an engineer, designing bridges that could connect communities and solve real-world problems. When he handed in his paper, he felt proud of what he had accomplished. But when Mrs. Harper returned it days later, her feedback was brutal. Across the top of the page, written in bold red ink, were the words, "Needs significant improvement, lacks originality." Beneath that, she had circled nearly every sentence, marking them with comments like unclear, repetitive, or simply try harder. The worst part, she hadn't given any specific suggestions for how to fix it. Marcus stared at the paper, his chest tightening. He glanced around the room and saw other students flipping through their graded essays, some smiling at positive remarks, while others frowned at minor corrections. None of them seemed to have received the kind of scathing critique he had. A girl sitting next to him leaned over and whispered, That doesn't seem fair. Marcus quickly shoved the paper into his folder before anyone else could see it, but the damage was done. Doubt crept into his mind. Was he really not good enough? Or was something else going on? To make matters worse, Mrs. Harper began assigning Marcus extra homework under the guise of helping him catch up. While the rest of the class worked on regular assignments, she'd hand him additional worksheets filled with challenging problems. At first, Marcus thought maybe she was trying to push him to do better, but it soon became clear that these tasks were designed to overwhelm him. One evening, after spending hours struggling through yet another set of equations, Marcus finally broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he slammed his pencil onto the desk. His mother, Sarah, heard the commotion and rushed into his room. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Marcus hesitated, unsure if he should tell her the truth. Finally, he mumbled, "It's Mrs. Harper. She keeps giving me all this extra stuff, and I don't think I can keep up." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern, but before she could press further, Marcus shook his head. "It's okay, Mom. I'll figure it out." But it wasn't okay, not by a long shot. The bullying didn't stop there. During a school assembly focused on grooming standards, Mrs. Harper singled Marcus out in front of the entire student body. As she lectured about maintaining a professional appearance, her eyes landed on him. "Some of you might think your hairstyles are fashionable," she said, glancing pointedly at Marcus's natural afro. "But professionalism means adhering to certain norms. Neatness matters." Gasps rippled through the audience, and Marcus froze, his face burning with shame. He had always taken pride in his hair, seeing it as a reflection of his identity. Now, it felt like she was attacking something deeply personal. Other students began to pick up on Mrs. Harper's cues, mimicking her disdainful attitude. In group projects, Marcus was often left out or given menial tasks, no matter how hard he tried to contribute. Even teachers who once greeted him warmly now seemed distant, as though they didn't want to get involved. The isolation weighed heavily on Marcus, making each day feel longer than the last. Still, he refused to give up completely. Deep down, he clung to the belief that things would get better somehow. He reminded himself of his father's words, "When people try to bring you down, it's because they see your potential." Those words kept him grounded, even as the world around him felt increasingly hostile. Unbeknownst to Marcus, the situation was about to reach a breaking point, one that would force everyone at St. Augustine's to confront the uncomfortable truths lurking beneath the surface. For now, though, Marcus carried the weight of Mrs. Harper's cruelty alone, determined to endure whatever came next. The tension in Marcus's life reached a boiling point one fateful afternoon during English class. Mrs. Harper had assigned the students an essay on their favorite book, and Marcus had chosen to write about a novel that explored themes of resilience and hope. He spent hours perfecting his work, carefully revising each sentence until he felt it truly reflected his thoughts. When the day came to present their essays, Marcus walked to the front of the room with a mix of nerves and determination. As he began reading aloud, he noticed Mrs. Harper leaning back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Halfway through his presentation, she suddenly interrupted him. "Marcus," she said sharply, cutting him off mid-sentence, "I think we've heard enough." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Without hesitation, she snatched the paper from his hands, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it onto the floor. "This is uninspired and poorly executed," she declared, her voice cold and dismissive. "If this is the best you can do, then perhaps you're not suited for advanced literature." Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks as whispers erupted around the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others smirked or giggled nervously. For a moment, Marcus thought he might cry, but instead, he clenched his fists tightly and returned to his seat without saying a word. The rest of the class continued as if nothing had happened, but the damage was done. Marcus felt like he'd been stripped bare in front of everyone, his confidence shattered. Later that day, a classmate named Emily approached him hesitantly in the hallway. She was soft-spoken and usually kept to herself, but something about what had happened earlier seemed to have struck a chord with her. "Hey, Marcus," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about what happened in class today. That wasn't fair." Marcus shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It's fine," he muttered, though his voice betrayed the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Emily frowned, shaking her head. "No, it's not fine. What she did was wrong. And honestly, I think more people should speak up about it." Before Marcus could respond, Emily pulled out her phone and showed him a video clip. It was footage of the incident in class, recorded by another student who had been sitting nearby. In the video, Mrs. Harper's harsh words echoed clearly, followed by the sound of gasps from the audience. Marcus stared at the screen, stunned. "How did you get this?" he asked. "I asked someone to send it to me," Emily explained. "Look, I know it's scary, but maybe you should show this to someone, like your parents or the principal. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." Marcus hesitated. The idea of sharing the video made him anxious. What if it only made things worse? But deep down, he knew Emily was right. He couldn't keep carrying this burden by himself. That evening, Marcus finally broke his silence. Sitting at the dinner table with his parents, he pushed his food around his plate, unable to eat. His mother noticed immediately. "Marcus, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked gently, taking a deep breath. Marcus told them everything. The extra homework, the constant criticism, the embarrassing comments about his appearance, and the humiliating scene in class. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down his face. Dr. Jonathan Johnson listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. Sarah wrapped an arm around Marcus, holding him close as he cried. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Marcus shrugged again, feeling guilty for keeping it hidden for so long. "I didn't want to bother you guys," he admitted softly. "I thought I could handle it." Dr. Johnson leaned forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You never have to handle something like this alone," he said firmly. "And you are not a bother. You hear me? This is serious, and we're going to fix it together." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know exactly how his father planned to address the situation, but hearing those words gave him strength. Little did Marcus realize the truth about his connection to the school, and his father's role as principal was about to change everything. The next morning, Dr. Jonathan Johnson arrived at St. Augustine's Academy earlier than usual, his mind racing with a mix of anger and determination. He had spent the entire night processing what Marcus had told him, replaying the stories of Mrs. Harper's behavior over and over in his head. As the school's new principal, he knew he had a responsibility to ensure fairness and safety for every student. But this situation hit painfully close to home. It wasn't just about policy or procedure, it was personal. This was his son being targeted, humiliated, and made to feel like he didn't belong. Dr. Johnson decided to act quickly but carefully. His first step was gathering evidence. He asked Marcus to share the video Emily had shown him, as well as any other instances where Mrs. Harper's actions could be documented. That evening, after reviewing the footage and listening to Marcus recount specific incidents, Dr. Johnson realized the extent of the problem. It wasn't just one bad day or an isolated comment. This was a pattern of discriminatory behavior that needed to be addressed immediately. The following afternoon, Dr. Johnson requested a private meeting with Mrs. Harper under the pretense of discussing curriculum updates. When she entered his office, her demeanor was calm and professional, as if nothing were amiss. She greeted him with a polite smile and took a seat across from his desk. "You wanted to see me, Dr. Johnson?" she asked, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Yes, thank you for coming," Dr. Johnson replied, his tone measured but firm. He began by asking general questions about her teaching methods and how she handled challenging students. At first, Mrs. Harper responded confidently, praising her own approach and insisting that she held all students to high standards. But then, Dr. Johnson shifted gears. "I've received some concerns recently about certain interactions in your classroom," he said, watching her closely. Without giving her time to respond, he played excerpts from the video Marcus had shared. The part where she interrupted him mid-presentation, crumpled his essay, and delivered her cutting remarks. The color drained from Mrs. Harper's face as she listened, her composure beginning to crack. When the clip ended, Dr. Johnson leaned forward slightly, his expression unyielding. "Care to explain what I just saw, Mrs. Harper?" he asked. For a moment, she sat silently, clearly caught off guard. Then, regaining some semblance of control, she stammered, I was simply trying to push him to do better. Sometimes tough love is necessary." Dr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. Tough love? Crumpling a student's work and publicly humiliating them isn't tough love. It's unacceptable. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "And this isn't the first instance. There are reports of you singling out Marcus repeatedly, assigning him excessive homework, and making inappropriate comments about his appearance. Do you deny these allegations?" Mrs. Harper's defenses began to falter. "I may have been strict, yes, but I assure you, my intentions were never malicious," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Dr. Johnson studied her carefully, noting the flicker of guilt in her eyes. He decided it was time to reveal the truth. "Let me make something clear," he said, his tone softening slightly but still commanding. "The student you've been mistreating is my son, Marcus, and I will not tolerate anyone treating him, or any child, with such disrespect and prejudice." The room went silent. Mrs. Harper's mouth dropped open, and for a brief moment she looked genuinely shocked. Her shoulders slumped as the weight of her actions, and the consequences, began to dawn on her. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If I had known." "You should have treated every student with respect, regardless of who their parents are," Dr. Johnson interrupted, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. "This isn't about me or my position. It's about accountability. Your behavior has created a hostile environment for Marcus and likely others. We cannot let this continue." Mrs. Harper tried to plead her case, promising to change and begging for another chance. But Dr. Johnson remained resolute. He assured her that the matter would be escalated to the school board, and appropriate action would follow. As she left his office, visibly shaken, Dr. Johnson felt a mix of relief and sadness. While holding her accountable was necessary, he couldn't help but wonder how many other students might have suffered in silence before now. Later that evening, Dr. Johnson sat down with Marcus and Sarah to discuss what had happened during the meeting. Marcus listened intently, his eyes wide with surprise when his father revealed that he'd confronted Mrs. Harper directly. "She didn't know I was your dad?" Marcus asked incredulously. The days following Dr. Johnson's confrontation with Mrs. Harper were tense, like the calm before a storm. Word spread quickly among the faculty about the principal's private meeting with her, though no one knew exactly what had transpired. Teachers exchanged uneasy glances in the staff lounge, and whispers filled the hallways. For Marcus, life at school felt suspended in uncertainty. He wasn't sure whether things would improve or worsen, but he could sense that something big was coming. Dr. Johnson wasted no time escalating the matter. He called an emergency session with the school board, presenting a detailed report outlining Mrs. Harper's conduct over the past several weeks. Alongside the video of her humiliating Marcus in class, he included testimonies from other students who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. Some described how she'd mocked Marcus's natural hair during grooming discussions. Others recounted instances where she singled him out unfairly. Even a few teachers admitted they'd noticed her bias, but hadn't known how to address it. At the board meeting, emotions ran high. One member argued that Mrs. Harper had been a respected educator for decades and deserved leniency, while another countered that her actions undermined the values St. Augustine's claimed to uphold. After hours of heated debate, the decision was unanimous. Mrs. Harper would be terminated immediately, effective at the end of the week. In addition, the school committed to implementing mandatory diversity training for all staff members and creating a system for students to report incidents of discrimination anonymously. When news of Mrs. Harper's dismissal reached the student body, reactions were mixed. Some cheered quietly, relieved that someone had finally stood up to her harsh treatment. Others expressed disbelief, claiming she was simply strict and didn't deserve to lose her job. A small group of students, however, rallied around Marcus, offering support and apologies for not speaking up sooner. Emily, who had encouraged Marcus to share his story, became one of his closest allies, often sitting with him at lunch and inviting him to join group projects. For Marcus, the aftermath of the scandal brought both relief and lingering unease. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that Mrs. Harper's behavior had consequences, but on the other, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, or worse, judged. Rumors swirled about why she had been fired, and some students speculated that Marcus must have used his father's position to get revenge. Though most of these accusations came from a place of ignorance rather than malice, they still stung. Determined to rise above the gossip, Marcus threw himself into his studies and extracurricular activities. He joined the school's debate club, channeling his experiences into passionate arguments about equality and justice. During one competition, he delivered a speech so compelling that even his harshest critics applauded. Slowly but surely, Marcus began rebuilding his confidence, proving to himself and to everyone else that he belonged at St. Augustine's just as much as anyone else. Meanwhile, Dr. Johnson worked tirelessly to ensure that the lessons learned from this incident wouldn't fade once the initial shock wore off. He organized workshops for parents, teachers, and students to discuss issues of privilege, bias, and inclusivity. At one assembly, he stood before the entire school and addressed the situation head-on. "What happened here was unacceptable," he said, his voice steady yet compassionate. "But it also gives us an opportunity to reflect and grow. Let's use this moment to create a community where every student feels valued, respected, and empowered." Marcus sat in the audience that day, listening intently as his father spoke. For the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of pride, not just in himself, but in his family. His father had handled the situation with grace and integrity, ensuring that accountability was met without resorting to vengeance. And though the scars of Mrs. Harper's bullying remained, Marcus realized they were also reminders of his resilience. As the semester progressed, Marcus noticed subtle changes in the school's atmosphere. Conversations about race and fairness became more open, and students started standing up for each other in ways they hadn't before. While there was still work to be done, Marcus could feel the tide shifting. The pain he'd endured hadn't been in vain. It had sparked meaningful change, not only for him, but for the entire St. Augustine's community. Months passed, and the ripple effects of Mrs. Harper's dismissal continued to reshape St. Augustine's Academy in ways no one could have anticipated. The school wasn't perfect, it never would be. But there was a palpable shift in its culture. Conversations that once felt taboo were now happening openly. Students and teachers alike began acknowledging the importance of treating everyone with fairness and respect, regardless of their background. For Marcus, this transformation was both validating and healing. One morning, during a school-wide assembly, Dr. Johnson announced the creation of a new scholarship fund named after Marcus. The Marcus Johnson Equity Scholarship, designed to support underrepresented students pursuing higher education. The initiative aimed to ensure that financial barriers wouldn't prevent talented individuals from achieving their dreams. As Dr. Johnson explained the purpose of the scholarship, he turned to Marcus, who sat nervously in the front row. "This scholarship is not just about honoring my son," he said, his voice warm but steady. "It's about recognizing the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, and inspiring others to do the same." The auditorium erupted into applause, and Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had never imagined being celebrated for something so painful, yet here he was, standing as a symbol of resilience and hope. When the principal invited him to say a few words, Marcus hesitated at first, unsure if he could speak without his voice cracking. But then he thought about all the students who might feel invisible or unheard, just as he once had. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "I didn't want any of this to happen," Marcus began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't ask to be treated differently or made fun of because of who I am. But when it did happen, I learned something important. Silence only makes things worse. If you see something unfair, speak up. If someone needs help, offer it. And if you're struggling, don't be afraid to ask for support." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or wiped away tears. By the time he finished speaking, the room was filled with cheers and whistles, a stark contrast to the isolation he'd felt just months earlier. Outside of school, Marcus found solace in reconnecting with old friends and forming new bonds. The classmates who had initially mocked him for his struggles now approached him with apologies, admitting they regretted staying silent while Mrs. Harper targeted him. Some even joined him in organizing events to promote inclusivity, such as cultural awareness days and panel discussions on overcoming bias. Through these efforts, Marcus discovered a passion for leadership, using his experiences to advocate for others facing similar challenges. At home, life returned to a sense of normalcy, or as close to normal as it could get after such a tumultuous year. Sarah often remarked how proud she was of her son, not just for enduring the hardships, but for emerging stronger and more compassionate. "You've grown so much, Marcus," she told him one evening over dinner. "And you've taught us all something valuable about standing up for what's right." Marcus smiled, feeling grateful for his family's unwavering support. Even Dr. Johnson found himself reflecting on the experience, realizing how much it had shaped his own perspective as an educator and leader. He vowed to continue fostering a safe and inclusive environment at St. Augustine's, knowing that true progress required constant effort. At parent-teacher conferences, he encouraged families to talk openly with their children about empathy, kindness, and accountability. "We can't change the past," he often said, "but we can build a better future, one conversation at a time." By the end of the school year, Marcus had transformed from the quiet boy trying to blend into the background into a confident young leader who inspired those around him. His grades soared, and he earned recognition for his contributions to the school community. More importantly, he carried within him a renewed sense of purpose. Though the scars of Mrs. Harper's bullying remained, they served as reminders of his strength and determination to create positive change. As graduation approached, Marcus looked back on the journey with a mix of emotions: pain, pride, and gratitude. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready to face whatever came next. After all, he had already proven that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to rise above and make a difference, not just for himself, but for others too. The final months of Marcus's time at St. Augustine's Academy were a whirlwind of activity and reflection. The scholarship fund named after him had become more than just an initiative. It was a movement. Students from diverse backgrounds applied, sharing stories of resilience and ambition that mirrored Marcus's own journey. Each application reminded him of the power of representation and opportunity, reinforcing his belief that no one should be held back by circumstances beyond their control. As graduation day approached, Marcus found himself thinking about how far he'd come since that first overwhelming day at the school. Back then, he'd felt like an outsider, unsure if he truly belonged in such a prestigious environment. Now, as he prepared to walk across the stage to receive his diploma, he realized he had earned not only academic success, but also respect and admiration from his peers. He wasn't just Marcus anymore. He was a role model, someone others looked up to for strength and perseverance. On the morning of graduation, Marcus stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cap and gown. His parents watched proudly from behind, their eyes glistening with tears. "You've grown into such an incredible young man," Sarah said softly, hugging him tightly. Dr. Johnson nodded, adding, "Today isn't just about celebrating your achievements. It's about recognizing the impact you've made on this school." Marcus smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He knew none of this would have been possible without the love and support of his family, and the courage to confront injustice when it mattered most. The ceremony was held outdoors under a bright blue sky, with rows of chairs filled with students, parents, and faculty members. As each graduate's name was called, applause echoed through the air. When it was Marcus's turn, the crowd erupted into cheers louder than for any other student. Friends waved enthusiastically, teachers clapped with genuine smiles, and even some former skeptics rose to their feet in acknowledgement. Walking across the stage, Marcus shook hands with Dr. Johnson, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. It was a moment neither of them would ever forget. In his valedictorian speech, later that afternoon, Marcus spoke candidly about the challenges he'd faced and the lessons he'd learned along the way. "This year taught me that adversity can either break you or build you stronger," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It showed me the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And it reminded me that change is possible, but only if we work together." His words resonated deeply, earning a standing ovation from the audience. Afterward, during the celebratory reception, countless people approached Marcus to congratulate him, not just for his accomplishments, but for inspiring them to think differently. Parents thanked him for sparking conversations at home about fairness and inclusion. Teachers admitted they'd reevaluated their own biases because of his courage. Even classmates who had once teased him now expressed regret and gratitude for the example he set. Looking around at the sea of smiling faces, Marcus felt a profound sense of closure. The pain he'd endured hadn't disappeared entirely. It lingered as faint scars, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it fueled his desire to create a better world. Whether through the scholarship fund, community activism, or simply leading by example, Marcus vowed to continue fighting for equity and justice wherever he went. That evening, as fireworks lit up the sky to mark the end of another school year, Marcus sat quietly with his family, reflecting on everything that had transpired. "Do you think things will always be this hard?" he asked his father, his tone thoughtful rather than defeated. Dr. Johnson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not always," he replied. "But every challenge you face will prepare you for the next one. And remember, you're never alone." As the night drew to a close, Marcus felt ready to step into the future. He carried with him not just memories of triumphs and struggles, but also a deep understanding of the responsibility that came with being a leader. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its obstacles, but Marcus knew he had the tools and the heart to overcome them. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly free, unburdened by the weight of the past, and excited for the endless possibilities ahead.